I'm a little surprised at the number of ways Hellblade 2 feels like a regression from the first game. Hellblade 1, Senua's Sacrifice, was developed by a team of only about 20 developers at Ninja Theory and released in 2017. Although limited in scope, the game is ambitious. It's tackling a complex area of mental health that takes place in a world that oscillates between punishingly grounded and nightmarishly surreal, and the whole thing rests on the back of the main character's performance, as portrayed by then untested actor Melina Juergens. Hellblade 2, Senua's Saga, was announced in 2019. In fact, it was the very first game announced for the new generation of Xbox consoles. The first game had been an unlikely hit. Ninja Theory was acquired by Microsoft, the game's team size ballooned from 20 developers to closer to 100, and then in 2024, we all finally got to play it. And it's interesting, you know? It's still pulling from that mix of real and surreal. It's still about Senua dealing with her psychosis. Melina Juergens is delivering another pretty unimpeachable performance. But there's a weird amount of stuff that feels missing from that previous smaller team and scrappier development. The first game had pretty memorable boss fights with a variety of creatures, but Hellblade 2 wholly excises bosses and doesn't even let you fight multiple guys at the same time. In Senua's Sacrifice, the game whisked us to a ton of memorable locations. There's a whole damn level in the Sea of Corpses. Senua's Saga centers itself totally in Iceland and struggles to make individual environments stand out. The first game was a focused story on Senua's growth, her desperate struggle against prior trauma, and its enduring rot. Hellblade 2 feels a little aimless in comparison, a story with more characters but less to say. But there's this caveat to all my complaints, because whenever I would start feeling the repetition of combat or environments, whenever I would wonder why exactly I was supposed to care about these characters, my frustration would be assuaged by a quite literally superficial fact. Hellblade 2 is the best looking game I've ever played. While playing Hellblade 2, a solid portion of my brain was devoted to this ongoing feat. A threatening slaver strides towards Senua, and that part of my brain goes, I've never seen someone emerge from the fog like that in a game before. She pulls herself agonizingly up a battered rock wall, and I think, I can't believe how well her hands are interacting with the geometry of that environment. Tortured by visions of monsters, she shuts her eyes, and I think, oh my god, I can actually see her eyeballs moving beneath her eyelids. And in some ways, this feels like the wrong way to interact with the game, right? Senua's Saga wants to be an emotionally impactful story of bravery and resilience. It wants to immerse you in its world and trick you into thinking its characters are real, and I'm sitting here instead admiring the cloud volumetrics. I sometimes wonder how to balance that conflict between the two wolves inside me, the tech enthusiast and the thoughtful critic. I mean, that conflict is incredibly clear just within Hellblade 2. I don't think it's a coincidence that the game's mechanics are so scaled back. At the same time, the graphics have been pushed to such extreme heights. What did Hellblade 2 sacrifice to look this good? Is the reason that the game lacks the boss fights or stunning realms of the first game because creating those same assets at this fidelity was prohibitively expensive? And maybe most importantly, how long will that trade-off hold up? I still enjoyed my time with Hellblade 2 despite its many flaws because its visuals do genuinely feel like they're showing me something I've never seen in a game before. But graphics like these, graphics operating at the peak of technical ability, age. They age fast. I said Hellblade 2 is the best looking game I've ever played. That's the truth. Before this, though, Red Dead Redemption 2 was the best looking game I'd ever played. Or Mirror's Edge, or I don't know, the Hydro Thunder arcade cabinet. The best looking game of all time is the most moving target in gaming, a position that's absolutely impossible to hold onto because something else will inevitably come to supplant you. You might think this makes discussions of the quality of graphics less meaningful then. Why spend so much time on something that will inevitably be outdated? But it's this inevitability that I think makes these discussions more interesting. Because the context of any given date's best-looking game ever tells us a huge amount about that era's technical leaps and hurdles, what could just be achieved, and how much that achievement cost. We can all name games that look timeless, that pursue a clearly defined artistic style. I spent plenty of time discussing the many routes a game can take to look beautiful, but today I want to regress, in a way, to talk about games that chase the most obvious and most elusive target, games that don't want to be the most graphically impressive of their style, but the most impressive full stop. As those games aged, as they slipped from a vision of the future to an artifact of the past, what became of their visual legacy? What is the afterlife of the best-looking game ever? But before we start, a word on capture quality. While my ability to talk about gaming history is decent for a random guy on the internet, my ability to capture this same history is woefully inadequate. I'm talking about 40 years of gaming history here, and with unlimited time and access to hardware, I would perfectly record each game I'm talking about in its original environment and resolutions. However, I actually have very little time, and even PS2 games are absurdly expensive now, let alone something like a Laserdisc. The games you'll see in this video are instead recorded using a hodgepodge of methods, some natively, some emulated, some generously donated by other folks online. Even if I did get it all off the appropriate machines myself, it still wouldn't be an accurate vision of what they looked like at the time. Our screens are different, the way we display images has fundamentally changed. All that is to say, my depictions of these games aren't perfect. Now, we return to our regularly scheduled programming. A mental game I like to play sometimes is basically the gaming equivalent of, what if you gave a medieval peasant a Dorito? That is, what if I took my current computer with its 8-core processor and 12 gigabytes of VRAM back to the 80s? What if I showed an arcade full of young Gen Xers Hellblade, or Cyberpunk, or Spider-Man? Would they even be able to grasp that they were looking at a game? Would their heads explode? Before I started blowing minds, though, I'd probably ask them what they thought the best-looking game ever was. And if I time-traveled to 1986, I bet I'd get a lot of people saying, Defender of the Crown. The Amiga 1000, or simply the Commodore Amiga at time of release, was not marketed primarily as a gaming machine. It would have been absurd to do so. It was released the same year as the Nintendo Entertainment System, but where the NES retailed for $200, the Amiga 1000 cost $1,285, and that's without the monitor. The Amiga wasn't just a gaming system, it was a personal computer, complete with art and video programs and a whole host of other features. But Computer Gaming World magazine still described it as a machine designed for games. And for $1,300 in the 80s, it needed to deliver some visuals you couldn't see anywhere else. Enter Cinemaware, a development studio with dreams of turning games into stunning interactive movies. They arguably never got closer to this goal than with their very first game, Defender of the Crown. It is not a complex game. Jimmy Marr of the Digital Antiquarian describes it as basically Risk played on a map of England, and says it manages the neat trick of being both too hard and too easy. But, like Hellblade 2, you wouldn't be coming to Defender of the Crown for its deep mechanics. Looking at Defender of the Crown in 2024, what you're likely to be compelled by is really skillfully done pixel art. For example, there's this scene where you raid a castle and your character casts a huge dramatic shadow on the wall behind him. Other compositions play with chiaroscuro lighting, jousting scenes have dozens of people in the audience, the racy romance scenes even feature seemingly transparent clothing when silhouetted by a fire. These effects are artistic sleight of hand. They're manually drawn in. Things like real-time shadowing wouldn't even be dreamed of for years. Instead, appreciating what was so revolutionary about Defender of the Crown requires remembering that simply rasterizing screens of this size, detail, and color was unheard of at home. Defender of the Crown released the same year as The Legend of Zelda and Kid Icarus. The difference between those and this feels monumentally more impressive than the jump from, 480p to 4K. What the Amiga was showing sat more comfortably among full arcade machines, and often surpassed even them. And ultimately, Defender of the Crown is just a simplified game of Risk, with artfully constructed, mildly interactive animations that play in the middle. The visuals really are the appeal, as was demonstrated when the game was ported to other, less graphically powerful systems. Marr writes, "Virtually all the ports were much better games than the Amiga version, fixing the minigames to make them comprehensible and reasonably entertaining, and tightening up the design. Even so, it remained and remains the Amiga version that most people find most alluring. Without those beautiful graphics, there just doesn't seem to be all that much point to Defender of the Crown." Once again, visual fidelity is matched with compromised interactivity. But Defender of the Crown mattered as a vision of the future. Developers who came up in the 80s will still talk about seeing Defender of the Crown for the first time, having their idea of the potential of graphics expanded by these screens. The Amiga itself was a tremendously important machine for gaming as a medium, not just for playing games, but creating them. The art and soundtracks for many games were created using Amiga computers, the hardware adopted in wide swaths by developers inspired by its art. It showed them a peek of what the future might look like. It's worth contrasting Defender of the Crown with another game 3 years its senior, a game that arguably had an even greater claim to the title of best-looking game ever: the lovingly drawn, soul-crushingly difficult Dragon's Lair.
Dragon's Lair, the fantasy adventure where you become a valiant knight on a quest to rescue the fair princess from the clutches of an evil dragon.
Dragon's Lair might be the pinnacle of mechanics sacrificed for visual fidelity. Comprised entirely of pre-animated snippets, every scene of Dragon's Lair exists as a simple binary. Hit the correct button at the correct time and the animation plays to completion. Mistime your input or hit any other button and the animation is interrupted by the, also lovingly drawn, game over screen. Dragon's Lair is, as many others have pointed out, basically a game-long QuickTime event. The game has almost exactly 22 minutes of possible gameplay, because that's how much footage the animators made for it. Compared to even the most basic video games, the possibility space for Dragon's Lair is severely limited. And while today we might look back and see similarities between Dragon's Lair's pre-animated cinematics and the barely interactive pixel art of Defender of the Crown, it's worth noting that these games are doing radically different things. Defender of the Crown was a game using actual computing power to render its high-quality art. Dragon's Lair was only computing relatively simple pass-fail states. Its lavish animation was instead held by the massive laser disc it ran on, the game's programming telling the disc where to seek next. Saying Dragon's Lair was the best-looking game ever would be kind of like saying Immortality is the best-looking game ever. You could make that argument, but you're likely to get groaned out of the room. Another vital difference between the two games is the context of how they were played. Defender of the Crown could be run at home, albeit on a relatively expensive computer. Dragon's Lair's Laserdisc could only be afforded and run by arcades. In this way, Dragon's Lair was extremely typical of graphics technology. For decades, basically up until the end of the 20th century, this is how gaming worked. You took what you could get at home, while recognizing that arcade cabinets were simply capable of more. When I was a kid, I pictured an arcade cabinet as packed literally top to bottom with circuitry. No wonder those games looked so great, I thought. They're filled with cubic feet of computing hardware. This is not exactly the case. But there were a number of things that pushed arcade cabinets above consumer gaming systems. They often contained hardware specifically tuned to the game they were running. They only had to be designed to do one thing. They could retail for thousands of dollars, thus justifying more expensive components and more dedicated R&D teams. Moreover, for an arcade machine to be successful, it needed to be able to pull people in, to dazzle them with images so tantalizing they couldn't help but give up their quarters. There's a reason the sizzling montage every arcade game runs when not in use is called the attract screen. If we're talking about the best looking games ever, we can't ignore arcades. From Dragon's Lair to the razor-sharp beauty of vector graphics, to the sheer speed and atmosphere of something like Outrun, arcades are where people would go to catch a glimpse of the future. And what vision of the future could compete with the beautiful blue skies of My expert consultant for this essay is Digital Foundry's John Linneman, although if I get anything wrong, that's on me, it's not on him. He says he remembers the exact moment he first saw the Daytona USA arcade machine. I can only imagine.
8 machines lined up against a wall in a local amusement park. I stared in awe as the smoothest, most detailed graphics I had ever seen danced across the row of CRT monitors. At the time, I didn't yet understand what the term frame rate was, but I knew just looking at this game that Daytona USA trounced every other 3D game on the market in terms of fluidity.
What was Daytona USA doing that other games hadn't? Well, it was running on the Sega Model 2 arcade board, a piece of hardware as close to space age as you could reasonably be. The board was literally developed in partnership with GE Aerospace. GE Aerospace has since been folded into Lockheed Martin, so I regret to inform you that Daytona USA is now a part of the military-industrial complex. But we can forgive it, because this game quite literally introduced the gaming world to texture filtering. You know when 3D games use some sort of techie magic to smooth out their sharp pixely edges? That's from Daytona. It also ran at the eye-melting resolution of 496 by 384, featured 16-bit color, and did all this at 60 frames per second. Seemingly every new generation of gaming shows off its technical abilities with a racing game, but the leap this represented is hard to even conceive of. For context, just a year prior, the top of the line was probably something like Virtua racing. This was 1992, and this was 1993. There's an aspect of fantasy to this era of Sega's arcade dominance. The idea that you could just keep pouring money into tech and research and keep reaping unbelievable jumps in fidelity. Also released alongside Daytona USA in 1993 was Virtua Fighter, the first fighting game with fully 3D graphics. It looked like this. And then just 3 years later, Virtua Fighter looked like this. Are you kidding me, man? It's a point in time where graphical growth feels near exponential. That game development was in almost perfect concert with simultaneous technical breakthroughs. This was arcade gaming's moment of visual ascendancy, the cash funneled into these games apparent the moment you saw them. And every 3D game today still exists in the wake of this period. The texture filtering introduced by Daytona is completely ubiquitous in almost everything released in the 21st century. 20 years after Virtua Fighter 3, games still boast of their detailed eyes and realistically flexing musculature. And yet, this was also the last moment of glory for arcades. Soon after, the Dreamcast would feature near parity to arcade performance. Arcades stopped drawing the same crowds, and thus lost their endless stream of R&D funding. Giant, purpose-built cabinets would never get the spotlight in the same way. You wouldn't venture into the arcade to get a glimpse of the future. Instead, companies would try and bring it into your living room. But despite this change in priorities, graphics continued to move at a lightning pace through the turn of the millennium. I couldn't make it through this video without mentioning the best gaming magazine cover ever, Unreal! Yes, This is an actual PC game screenshot. There's the unbelievable gulf between Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2, for instance, the similarly massive jump between Final Fantasies just 4 years apart. But if you wanted to see the future of graphics in 2001, you'd have to do what now feels like a completely random series of events. Go to Tokyo to watch Steve Jobs introduce Doom 3. This whole presentation, Tokyo Macworld 2001, is fascinating. Before Jobs brings out John Carmack to talk Doom, he starts talking about Pixar. Specifically, the Pixar short Luxo Jr., made in 1986, the source of the company's desk lamp mascot. He talks about how in 1986, using a supercomputer, it took 3 hours to render each frame. And then they pull out the same short, except now, in 2001, it's running in real time, powered by NVIDIA's GeForce 3. This is still the language we use today, how what used to take hours or days can be rendered in milliseconds, that Kingdom Hearts looks as good as Toy Story, Final Fantasy surpasses The Spirits Within. Anyway, then Jobs brings out Carmack. Carmack doesn't actually call the presentation Doom 3 at any point, just says that it's the engine they're working with for their next game. But he says something even more exciting, that this next step represents the final unification of lighting and shadow across all surfaces in a game. He says for years, games have had to trick their way into appropriate lighting, different things for characters and environments, different techniques for static lights and moving ones. Now, the power of the hardware and their engine would make everything simpler. Now every pixel could be lit by the same sources. And while he talks, the presentation zooms through the halls of what would become Doom 3, the real-time graphics in many ways exceeding even the pre-rendered game cinematics of just a few years before. It wouldn't be until 2004 that Doom 3 fully released. Even still, there was nothing like it. Hell, even today, there's nothing quite like Doom 3. The commitment the game has to its lighting engine is near fanatical, the entire atmosphere of the game determined by how light and shadow interact. Even the opening minutes of the game, the peaceful walk through a research base on Mars that hasn't yet been overtaken by demons from hell, is drenched in darkness. NPCs sit in barely lit rooms with long shadows stretching across their face, giant machines throw silhouettes against the wall as they work. I can't help but think of that beautifully faked shadow in Defender of the Crown, the computer struggling to display even a mostly static image. You could have witnessed the release of both Defender of the Crown and Doom 3 and barely be old enough to vote. Playing Doom 3, you get the sense that the entire game was constructed around its new graphical abilities. Unlike Dooms 1 and 2, 3 is firmly planted in the horror genre, the lighting doing most of the work in portraying the damned research station. Early in the demon invasion, you'll see a pitch-black corner suddenly light up red as an imp ignites a fireball, and that red glow will follow the fireball as the imp chucks it into your face. It's legitimately incredible. I have no nostalgia for Doom 3. I hadn't played it prior to doing research for this video, and the atmosphere hit just as hard regardless. It's a testament to how well Doom 3 establishes itself as a horror title that I never really questioned what the lighting engine can't do. You look at the environments and wonder, why wasn't this the start of every game using light like this? But really, there's a simple answer. The engine could only handle direct illumination. That is, when you shine your flashlight on a wall, you only light up that wall. Unlike real life, the light is unable to bounce, can't continue making its way around the environment. The wonderfully evocative artistic choice in Doom 3 to only feature harsh divisions between light and inky black is also an engine limitation. That attempt at the final unification of lighting and shadow doesn't allow for soft, indirect light. And 20 years later, we're still chasing that goal. This is what ray tracing is trying to solve today, In the ultra-demanding path-tracing modes of games like Cyberpunk, we can see gaming getting just a little closer. Light and shadow, character and environment, all still hoping to be unified. Around the time of Doom 3, the rate of best-looking games ever was getting out of hand. In 2002, Capcom released their remake of the first Resident Evil, featuring quite possibly the most beautifully integrated pre-rendered backgrounds ever seen in a game. In 2003, Konami released Silent Hill 3, with uncannily detailed character models and texture work. In the time since Silent Hill 3, there have of course been characters rendered at a higher fidelity than Heather Mason, but whenever I play it, I think this is the best a character has ever needed to look. In 2004, alongside Doom 3, Valve released a little game called Half-Life 2, with large, complex environments, great-looking water, and a physics system so good it could be the main mechanical hook. What's interesting to me about this time period is that, unlike in the 80s, and somewhat unlike today, the biggest graphical leaps weren't being made by games with severely limited interactivity. Unlike Dragon's Lair or Hellblade 2, these are all game-ass games with complex mechanical systems and big show-offy boss fights. I don't have a perfect explanation for why this is the case. Maybe it's just due to genre popularity. The walking simulator wasn't really a thing. The closest equivalent might actually be cutscene-heavy, gameplay-simple titles like Dream Factor's The Bouncer. You could also look at the stripped-down world of a game I've mentioned a few times in the past, Shadow of the Colossus. Colossus did take a more minimalistic approach to gameplay than many other PS2 games, but it certainly didn't apply the same ethos to its graphics, insisting on huge landscapes and enemies, involved physics, fur rendering, and even cinematic motion blur. Shadow of the Colossus is maybe my favorite example of, we're gonna do everything, performance be damned. On the original PS2, the game chugged along at something like 18 frames per second, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But by then, it was 2005, and there was a game on the horizon that would define the next era of conversations about the best-looking game ever. That is, if you could even run it.
Yeah, but can it run Crysis?
Hardware-wise, consoles are pretty static environments. A game created for the PS2 needed to target that one specific technical platform. Developers couldn't reasonably make a PS2 game for what the PS3 might be able to do. But the PC is a different beast. Games can be, in a way, designed for possible futures. There's no more famous example of this than Crysis. Put simply, to run Crysis on the highest settings, you would need 2007's absolute top-of-the-line hardware. Upon Crysis's release, you'd be lucky to have a graphics card with more than half a gigabyte of VRAM, but the game's highest settings could gobble up far more than that. The game wanted blazing fast CPU speeds, and even demanded 2 whole gigabytes of memory. For many consumers, they wouldn't have a system with these specs for years after Crysis's release. Fortunately, in this respect, 2024 has finally turned the tables on Crysis. For example, my current GPU has 12 entire gigabytes of VRAM, 24 times that of 2007's cards. And I'll tell you, even 17 years later, turning every setting to very high while running the game in 4K is extremely satisfying. And in 2024, it's even more obvious the many ways Crysis was a preview of the future of graphics. This is the game we have to thank for ambient occlusion, a now ubiquitous feature used to generate more realistic shadows. Crysis's opening uses volumetric clouds, real 3D objects in the sky, not just static skyboxes, the same tech that makes the skies of Flight Simulator or Red Dead Redemption 2 so stunning. Crysis has incredible per-object motion blur, it has remarkably detailed parallax occlusion maps, it has real-time contact shadows, it has a million other jargony buzzwords I could throw at you that all make up the standard toolkit of most game engines today. I mean, my god, look at those character models! 2007! But the most fascinating thing about Crysis might not be its easily trackable technical influences. Instead, playing Crysis today, I can't get over how it feels like a peek into a future that never quite occurred. This is even true on a technical level. As Alex Battaglia noted in 2018, the expectation for PC computing was that the real increase in speed in computing would happen from massive increases in clock speeds, with the expectations of anything up to 8 GHz Pentiums in the future. It never happened, of course. Crysis predicted that the individual cores of CPUs would just get faster and faster, and they didn't really, instead opting to expand the number of cores with similar clock speeds. This is a very technical point that helps explain why, on Crysis's heaviest levels, even modern CPUs can't consistently run the game at high frame rates. For most gamers though, the details of how their CPU makes calculations don't matter, as long as the game works. But matched with this technical misprediction are other more visible ways Crysis shows a different possible future. It is a shockingly destructible game, for instance, and not just in the easy ways. Have you played a game since 2007 that lets you do this with trees? I can't stop shooting the trees! Crysis launched with a level editor that showed off just how in-depth the physics system truly was. John Linneman said it reminded him of the promise of that first level of Metal Gear Solid 2, the idea that game worlds would soon match their remarkable fidelity with equally remarkable interactivity. Neither of these promises really came to pass, however. Crysis 2 and 3 eventually came out, and they maybe looked better than Crysis 1, but in more limited, corralled ways. They were made to run on contemporaneous consoles, and not just the PCs of the future. Many of the post-Crysis best-looking games ever took a step away from this depth of interactivity. The 7th generation of consoles began Naughty Dog's reign as king of best-looking games, with the first 3 Uncharted games trading wide, flexible zones for narrow corridors to jump and shoot through. The Frostbite engine did some unbelievable work on the Battlefield games, both in wide multiplayer and tight single-player scenarios. For years, my personal pick for best-looking game ever was God of War 3, which featured both colossal characters and environments while simultaneously featuring some really detailed and evocative lighting work, as long as you were okay with relinquishing all camera control. And, of course, this era also saw the release of my beloved Mirror's Edge, its cold beauty and timeless aesthetic already the focus of a video I made years ago. But maybe the best-looking characters on the consoles lived in the shakily written worlds of Quantic Dream. Both Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls traded almost all interactivity for genuinely stunning rendering of quite limited worlds. Heavy Rain's loading screens are simply close-up shots of the characters' faces, their vividly realized eyes and facial tics implying some level of internal life. Once you make it into the game, though, these characters are only able to do rigidly defined actions, stiffly walking around the environment until they happen upon an interactable prompt. They are, in a way, returning to the idea of Dragon's Lair, a largely pre-decided movie that players interact with through limited QuickTime events. For what it's worth, the game's director, David Cage, said, "No, we don't make Dragon's Lair. This is not Dragon's Lair. Do you think I'm crazy? I'm not stupid. Do you think I develop on the PlayStation 3 to do Dragon's Lair again? It would be absurd." But for the record, I don't think his word is actually worth that much. However, for as many gorgeous games as this generation had, the feeling of the jumps shrank. The gulf in years became less significant. Many of you are probably familiar with this graphic showing the decreasing effect of increased polygon counts. What this image doesn't reveal is the rough edges resulting from continuous increases in fidelity. Janky animations stand out far more when placed within a near photoreal world. The gulf in detail that's always existed between main characters and unimportant NPCs becomes far more obvious. Environments need geometrical complexity to match their high-res textures, or they risk looking like a Minecraft HD mod. Maybe this is why the scope of the best-looking game ever so often narrows. A fairly uncontentious pick for the best-looking game on the PS4 would be 2015's The Order 1886, a 6-hour title with roughly equal time allotted to combat and cutscenes. The Order is remembered almost entirely for its visuals, and with a not insignificant level of disdain.
This is where we're at now, huh? A CGI movie with some basic cover shooting stapled to it?
But this is the way technical advancement works sometimes. Major sacrifices required for a glimpse at the future. The Order 1886 is one of the pioneers of physically based rendering, showing off its tech before the PS4 had even launched. This is, in short, a way of making digital materials exhibit the same qualities as their real-life counterparts, with things like appropriate reflectiveness and light scattering. While all these techniques look incredible in-game, the Order's true legacy has been defined by developer Ready at Dawn's willingness to share. In GDC talks and slide decks widely available online, the tech team broke down how and why they went to such lengths with their graphics in spectacularly granular detail, spending pages and pages showing how they made a single copper spigot. There's no telling how many games have since utilized Ready at Dawn's development pipelines. Their single-minded focus on creating the best-looking game ever, blazing the way for countless other developers to learn from their passion. This will have to be their legacy. Just a few weeks ago, Ready at Dawn was shut down by its parent company Meta, just another casualty in our continuous culling of industry talent. The search for the best-looking game ever is eternal, Sisyphean. Is it now Cyberpunk, with its beautifully bounced lighting, Red Dead Redemption 2 with its unbelievable atmospheric effects and absurdly detailed interiors? For me, at present, it's Hellblade 2, with eyes and faces imbued with a life unlike anything I've seen before, a devotion to animation that eschews playability for agonizing verisimilitude. And all of this will be moot in no time at all. The trailer for Grand Theft Auto 6 promises yet another step towards that elusive horizon, the best-looking game ever, until one more takes its place. And I often do stop and think, do we need any of this? This endless relay, this procession towards an unachievable goal? I mean, are any of these games actually more beautiful than Okami? I don't think so. But what that perspective misses is the way these achievements rely and build on each other. Each studio might be Sisyphus, pushing that boulder up a mount, but in this case, the boulder smooths a little of the slope out each time. The road to the best-looking game ever is generously paved by every other that came before, from Defender of the Crown to Daytona to Crysis and Hellblade, each revealing the possibility of the next digital world. Of course, with a topic like this, I'm inevitably going to miss some huge games. The gorgeous Donkey Kong Country somehow didn't make the cut, Soul Calibur was benched, I somehow went this whole time without saying the phrase, The Last of Us Part 2. But there's one game that stood out, that I realized with horror I finished my script without saying a single word about. Batman Arkham Knight. But I didn't want to cram Arkham Knight into this already overstuffed essay, so I wrote a whole separate video on it. On Nebula, and only on Nebula, you can find this entirely new video essay. How does Arkham Knight still look so good? I remember in 2018, people saying, wow, remember how good Arkham Knight looked with this shot of the city? And then in 2020, people were saying, wow, how did Arkham Knight look this good 5 years ago, with probably the same shot of the city? And then in 2022, we all had a good reminisce about how good Arkham Knight looked, and now, in 2024, the Arkham Knight looked great cottage industry is flourishing with the release of new and more disappointing games in the Batman universe. This is not the first time I've put an entirely new video on Nebula. It's not even the 20th time I've done that. Nebula is home to years of exclusive work from me, whether it's focused essays, conversations with friends, cooking videos, or uncensored versions of videos that had to be pared down for YouTube. If you like my work at all, if a month feels like too long to wait between my essays, Nebula is right there for you. And here's the good news, you can get all that for 40% off when you sign up for a year. That is, if you follow my link in the description. Nebula isn't just a platform for Jacob Geller fans either. There's all sorts of stuff for you to discover. You can watch the whole series The Getaway now, see bonus videos from my esteemed colleagues Big Joel and Leo Vader, or, circling back to me, listen to exclusive episodes of my podcast, Something Rotten. I've been talking up Nebula for most of the time I've been on YouTube at this point. We're not slowing down. We're only picking up speed. So, what's the secret to Arkham Knight's aesthetic? Is it important that Batman is so wet? Does the game actually look better than this year's Suicide Squad? All that and more, so much more, when you join Nebula. Sign up now for a full 40% off your annual subscription when you follow the link in the description.
Oh! Please save me! The cage is locked with a key. The dragon keeps it around his neck. To slay the dragon, use the magic sword.